The silent rancher. The dust swirled in angry clouds around the makeshift camp as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. 6 men sat in a rough circle, their faces weathered by years of hard living and harder choices. In the center of their gathering, like a prize to be divided, stood Sarah McKenna, her hands bound behind her back, her green dress torn and dusty from the long ride. "Now then, boys," drawled Jake Holloway, the self-appointed leader of this ragtag band of outlaws, "seems we got ourselves a valuable commodity here." He spat into the dirt and adjusted his black hat, revealing a jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. "Question is, what do we do with her?" The girl, barely 19, with auburn hair that caught the dying light like spun copper, lifted her chin defiantly despite the fear that flickered in her emerald eyes. She had been traveling with the supply wagon to her uncle's ranch when these men had descended upon them like vultures. The wagon driver, old Pete Jameson, lay somewhere back on the trail, and she tried not to think about whether he was dead or merely unconscious. "I say we keep her," growled Murphy, a thick-set man with arms like tree trunks and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. "Pretty thing like that could fetch a fine price down in Mexico." "Mexico's a long ride," countered Slim Watkins, whose nickname was a cruel joke given his considerable girth. "Lot can happen between here and there." Sarah's stomach churned at their casual discussion of her fate, but she forced herself to remain silent. These were men who fed on fear, and she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Could always send word to her family," suggested Carson, the youngest of the group, barely 25 but already with the cold eyes of a killer. "Ransom might be the smart play." Jake leaned back against his saddle, considering. "McKenna's got money, that's for certain. Old Angus McKenna didn't build that spread by accident." He studied Sarah with calculating eyes. "But money in hand now versus money promised later." He shrugged. "Bird in the hand, as they say." The discussion continued as the shadows lengthened, each man throwing in his opinion on what should be done with their captive. Sarah listened to them debate her future as if she were a head of cattle, her anger building with each crude suggestion. She tested the ropes binding her wrists, but Murphy knew his knots well. As the last rays of sunlight painted the canyon walls red, Jake stood and dusted off his chaps. "All right, boys, I've made my decision." The words died in his throat as the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. Every man in the circle went for his gun, heads swiveling toward the narrow entrance to their hidden camp. The rhythmic clip-clop of a single horse grew louder, echoing strangely in the confined space. "Just one rider," whispered Slim, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "Could be a mistake." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Or could be law. Everyone stay calm." The horse and rider appeared through the gap in the rocks, moving at an unhurried walk. The man sat tall in his saddle, broad-shouldered and lean, wearing a brown duster that had seen better days. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of a worn hat, but there was something in his bearing that made even these hardened criminals take notice. He guided his horse, a magnificent black stallion that moved with the fluid grace of a cat, directly toward their circle, showing no sign of surprise or concern at finding 6 armed men holding a bound woman. When he was 20 feet away, he pulled up and sat perfectly still, studying the scene before him. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Sarah found herself holding her breath, hope and fear warring in her chest. Was this rescue or simply another predator drawn to the scent of blood? "You lost friend?" Jake called out, his hand hovering near his gun. "This here's a private gathering." The stranger said nothing. His horse stamped once, eager to move, but the rider's hands were steady on the rein. In the growing twilight, Sarah could make out more details. The man was perhaps 35, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and a jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble. But it was his eyes that held her attention, pale blue and utterly calm, like still water. "I asked you a question, stranger." Jake's voice carried an edge now. "You best answer when a man speaks to you." Still the newcomer remained silent. He shifted slightly in his saddle, and Sarah caught the glint of metal, a star pinned to his vest, mostly hidden by the duster. Her heart. A lawman. Murphy had noticed it too. "Jake," he said quietly, "look at his vest." Jake's eyes flicked down and his face went hard. "Well now, seems we got ourselves a tin star." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're a long way from anywhere, Marsh. Might want to turn around and ride back the way you came." The stranger's gaze moved slowly around the circle, taking in each man's position, the weapons within reach, the angles and distances. When his eyes fell on Sarah, they lingered for a moment, and she saw something flicker there, anger, perhaps, or determination. Then his attention returned to Jake. I said right on, law dog. Jake's voice was louder now, meant to bolster his own confidence as much as intimidate the newcomer. You got no business here. The stranger reached up slowly, so slowly that no one could mistake the gesture for aggression, and touched the brim of his hat. Then in one fluid motion he dismounted. What the hell do you think you're doing? Carson demanded, his gun halfway out of its holster. The stranger tied his horse's reins to a low scrub brush and walked toward them, his boots making soft sounds in the dirt. When he reached the edge of their circle, he stopped and raised his right hand, palm open and empty. Ancient right, he said, and his voice was quiet but carried clearly in the still air. I claim parley. The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah had heard of such things in the old stories her grandfather used to tell, codes of honor from the early days of the frontier, when even outlaws had certain rules they lived by. Jake's face went through several expressions before settling on one of grudging recognition. Parley, he repeated slowly. Been a long time since I heard that word used proper. He glanced around at his men, who were looking uncertain. You know what you're asking, stranger? The marshal nodded once. I know. Jake was quiet for a long moment, thinking. The right of parley was an old frontier tradition, a way for enemies to meet and speak without violence, under the protection of shared honor. To violate parley was to mark oneself as beyond the pale, unworthy of trust or respect from any man. Even outlaws had limits. All right, Jake said finally. You got your parley, state your business. The stranger stepped into the circle, moving with the easy confidence of a man comfortable with violence, but unafraid of it. Up close, Sarah could see the years in his face, not old, but seasoned. There were scars on his hands and a careful way he held himself that spoke of past wounds. The girl goes free, he said simply. Jake laughed, a harsh sound in the desert air. Just like that, you ride in here alone and think you can just take what we claim as ours? She's not yours to claim. Law says different. We found her, we keep her. The stranger's pale eyes fixed on Jake's. What law would that be? The only law that matters out here, Marshal. The law of the gun. Then you've already broken parley, the stranger said quiet. Parley means we settle this with words, not weapons. Jake's face flushed, and Sarah could see him struggling with himself. To break parley would shame him before his own men, but to let this lone lawman walk away with their prize was equally unthinkable. You got nothing to bargain with, Jake said finally. 6 guns against 1, and you calling for parley just means you can't draw on us. Seems like poor strategy, Marshal. The stranger was quiet for a moment, then he reached into his vest, slowly, carefully, and pulled out a leather wallet. He opened it and extracted something that glinted in the firelight. Gold, he said, holding up a $20 coin. 20 eagles, fresh from the Denver Mint. The outlaws leaned forward despite themselves. $400 was more money than most of them had ever seen at one time. Where would a marshal get that kind of money? Slim asked suspiciously. Reward money, collected over the years. The stranger's voice was matter of fact. 400 for the girl. She walks free. I ride out, and you boys divide the gold among yourselves. Sarah felt a strange mix of hope and offense. Was she worth only $400 to this silent man? But as she watched his face, she began to understand. This wasn't about her value, it was about giving these men a choice between certain profit and uncertain violence. Jake was thinking hard, she could see it in his eyes. $400 split 6 ways was still better than most jobs they pulled, and without the risk of bullets flying. How do we know it's real? Murphy asked. The stranger tossed one of the coins to him. Murphy bit it, tested its weight, and nodded slowly. Genuine. And how do we know you won't come back with a posse once the girl's safe? Carson wanted to know. You have my word. Jake snorted. Word of a lawman. That's supposed to mean something. The stranger was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, my name is Thomas Riley. I've been a U.S. Marshal for 12 years. In that time I've never broken my word to any man, honest or otherwise. He paused. Ask around. The name carries weight. Even Sarah had heard of Thomas Riley. They called him the Silent Marshal, a man who tracked his quarry across impossible distances and brought them in alive when possible, dead when necessary. More importantly, he had a reputation for honesty that even criminals respected. Jake looked around at his men, reading their faces. She could see the greed warring with suspicion, the desire for easy money fighting against their natural distrust of authority. 400 is good money, Slim said quietly. Better than most jobs, and a lot less risky. Could set us up for a while, Carson added. Maybe head down to New Mexico, lay low for a season. Murphy just held up the gold coin, letting it catch the firelight. Real as sunshine, Jake looked at Sarah, then at Riley, then at the leather wallet in the marshal's hand. Finally he nodded slowly. All right, Marshal, you got yourself a deal. He gestured to Murphy. Cut her loose. As Murphy sawed through the ropes binding Sarah's wrists, Riley counted out the remaining coins, stacking them neatly on a flat rock in the center of the circle. The outlaws watched every movement, but there was a different tension now, the anticipation of profit rather than violence. When her hands were free, Sarah rubbed her wrists where the ropes had chafed, trying to get feeling back into her fingers. She wanted to say something to this man who had bought her freedom, but his attention was focused on the outlaws, watching for any sign of treachery. There's your gold, Riley said, stepping back from the coins. 400, as promised. Jake moved forward and picked up one of the eagles, testing it like Murphy had done. Satisfied, he began dividing the coins into 6 equal piles. Pleasure doing business with you, Marsh. Riley nodded to Sarah. Ma'am, if you'd mount up, we'll be on our way. She started toward his horse, then stopped. What about my things? My bag was in the wagon. Gone, Jake said without looking up from the coins. Wagon burned, everything with it. You're lucky to be alive, girl. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the loss, not for the clothes or jewelry, but for the small mementos of her parents that had been in that bag. Riley seemed to understand without being told. Sometimes what matters most can't be replaced, he said quietly, but sometimes it can be rebuilt. She nodded, swallowing her grief, and accepted his help in mounting behind him on the big stallion. The horse was patient beneath their combined weight, well-trained and steady. One more thing, Marshal, Jake called as they prepared to leave. You meant what you said about not coming back with a posse? Riley looked down at him from the saddle. I meant what I said, but I didn't say anything about other marshals, or about what might happen if you boys caused trouble in my territory again. Jake's smile faded. Your territory? Everything from here to the Colorado border. I'd suggest you boys ride south and keep riding. Without waiting for a response, Riley turned his horse and rode out of the circle, Sarah holding tight to his waist. As they made their way through the rocky passage and out into the open desert beyond, they rode in silence for an hour, the horse picking its way carefully through the gathering darkness. Behind them, the glow of the outlaws' campfire gradually faded until it was just another star in the vast night sky. Sarah had 100 questions, but something about the marshal's bearing suggested that conversation could wait. Finally, when they reached a small stream where the horse could drink, Riley called a halt. He helped Sarah down and then tended to his mount, checking hooves and adjusting the saddle. Only when the animal was comfortable did he turn his attention to her. Are you hurt? He asked. No. Scared, but not hurt. She studied his face in the moonlight. Why did you help me? You don't know me. Riley was quiet for a moment, looking out across the silver landscape. Had a sister once, he said finally, about your age when she died. Sometimes a man gets a chance to do something right, even if it's too late to matter where it should. Sarah felt her throat tighten at the pain in his voice. I'm sorry, he shrugged. Long time ago. He gestured toward a cluster of rocks. We'll rest here tonight. Your uncle's ranch is a hard day's ride, and the horse needs sleep. As they settled down to wait for dawn, Sarah wrapped herself in Riley's spare blanket, and watched him clean his rifle by moonlight. He worked with the methodical precision of a man for whom weapons were tools of survival rather than symbols of power. That money, she said eventually, was it really reward money? Riley paused in his cleaning. Some of it. And the rest? My save. 12 years of Marshall's pay doesn't amount to much, but it was enough. Sarah stared at him in amazement. You spent your life savings to buy my freedom from those men. Money comes and goes, some things matter more. She was quiet for a long time, overwhelmed by the simple generosity of this taciturn man. In her world of cattle ranches and proper society, men showed off their virtue with grand gestures and flowery speech. This man had risked his life, and spent his fortune with no more fanfare than ordering coffee at a restaurant. I'll pay you back, she said finally, when we reach my uncle's ranch. No need, but no need, he repeated, and something in his tone suggested the subject was closed. As the night wore on and the desert cold crept in, Sarah found herself studying this enigmatic man who had appeared out of nowhere to save her. Thomas Riley, the silent marshal. She had heard the stories how he had tracked the Brennan gang across 3 territories, how he had faced down 5 armed men in Dodge City with nothing but his voice and his reputation, but the man sitting across from her quietly watching the horizon for trouble seemed almost tired, perhaps, lonely, certainly. When dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Riley was already saddling his horse. They rode hard that day, stopping only to rest the animal and share water from Riley's canteen. As the sun reached its zenith, Sarah finally saw the familiar landmarks of her uncle's land, the distinctive red rocks that marked a boundary of the Circle M Ranch. The ranch house sat in a valley between 2 low hills, a sprawling adobe structure surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. As they approached, Sarah could see men working with horses in the main corral, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Home, safety. Her uncle, Angus McKenna, emerged from the house as they rode into the yard. He was a big man, well into his 60s but still straight-backed and strong. His weathered face broke into a smile when he saw Sarah, then shifted to wariness as he took in her disheveled condition and her silent companion. "Sarah, lass, we've been worried sick. Pete Jameson's horse came back without him yesterday and no sign of the wagon." His accent still carried hints of the Scotland he had left 40 years ago. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Uncle Angus." Sarah slid down from the horse and ran into his arms, finally allowing herself to feel safe enough for tears. "Pete, I don't know what happened to Pete." Angus held her tight, his eyes fixed on Riley. "And who might you be, stranger?" Riley dismounted and touched his hat brim. "Thomas Riley, U.S. Marshal. Your niece ran into some trouble on the trail. She's safe now." Recognition dawned in the older man's eyes. "Riley, I've heard the name. You have my thanks, Marshal. Whatever you did to bring her home safe, you have my gratitude." "Just doing my job." But Sarah pulled away from her uncle and looked at Riley with eyes that blazed with emotion. "No, it wasn't just your job. You saved my life, and you lost everything you had to do it." Angus raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Before Riley could protest, Sarah told her uncle the whole story. The attack on the wagon, her capture by the outlaws, and Riley's incredible sacrifice to buy her freedom. Angus listened in growing amazement, his respect for the quiet marshal obviously deepening with every word. $400, he said when she finished. "Your life savings." He studied Riley with new eyes. "That's not something a man does lightly." Riley shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "Like I told your niece, some things matter more than money." "Aye, they do, but money matters too, especially to a working man." Angus clapped Riley on the shoulder. "You'll stay for dinner at least, and we'll talk about that $400. "No need for talk," Riley said. "I should be heading back. Got duties to attend to." "Marshal," Angus said, and his voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "You'll stay for dinner if I have to hog-tie you to do. A man saves my kin, he gets fed proper before he rides on. That's McKenna law, and it supersedes whatever federal authority you might carry." Despite himself, Riley smiled. The first time Sarah had seen him do so, it transformed his face, making him look younger and less careworn. "Well, when you put it like that." The dinner was a grand affair by ranch standards. Angus's cook, a Mexican woman named Rosa, who had been with the family for 20 years, outdid herself with thick steaks, fresh bread and apple pie that could have won prizes at any county fair. Sarah had changed into clean clothes and pinned up her hair, but she found her attention constantly drawn to the quiet marshal who sat at her uncle's right hand. Over the meal, Angus drew Riley out with the skill of a man who had spent decades reading other men's character. Gradually, the marshal's story emerged. The son of a Kansas farmer who had lost his family to a cholera outbreak, the young man who had drifted west seeking purpose, the deputy who had earned his federal commission through courage and honesty rather than political connection. 12 years, Angus mused. "That's a long time to be riding alone." "Comes with the territory," Riley said. "Marshals don't generally have time for settled things. Maybe it's time you made time." Riley glanced at Sarah, who was pretending to focus on her pie while listening to every word. "Maybe," he said quietly. After dinner, Angus insisted on walking Riley to the barn where his horse was being cared for. Sarah followed at a distance, curious about what her uncle might say to the man who had saved her life. $400, Angus said without preamble. "Your life savings. I told you. I know what you told me. Now I'm telling you something." Angus stopped and faced the marshal. "I'm a wealthy man, Riley, not rich by Eastern standards, but I do well enough. That $400 you spent, I could pay it back 10 times over, and never miss the money."
Riley shook his head. I don't want charity. Who said anything about charity? I'm talking about a job. That got Riley's attention. What kind of job? Ranch foreman. The man I've got now is getting on in years, wants to retire back to town. The job pays well, includes a house and the work's honest. Angus paused. Also happens my niece will be staying on permanent life. Her parents died in a carriage accident back east, and she's got nowhere else to go. Riley was quiet for a long moment. Sarah held her breath, suddenly realizing how much she wanted him to say yes. I'm not sure I'm suited for ranch work, Riley said finally. Any man who can track outlaws across 3 territories can learn to manage cattle and cowboys. Question is, do you want to? Riley looked toward the house, where warm light spilled from the windows and the sound of Rosa's laughter drifted on the evening air. After 12 years of camping under stars and eating cold beans from a can, the scene must have looked like paradise. I'd need to finish my current cases, he said slowly, tie up loose ends. Angus smiled. Take all the time you need, job'll be waiting. As Riley rode out the next morning, Sarah stood on the porch and watched until he disappeared over the hill. He had promised to return, but she wondered if he really would. Men like Thomas Riley were creatures of the open road, comfortable with solitude and duty. Could such a man really settle into the rhythms of ranch life? 6 weeks later, she had her answer. She was hanging laundry behind the house when Rosa called out that a rider was approaching. Sarah's heart leaped as she recognized the black stallion and its silent rider. But this time, Riley led a pack horse loaded with gear, and when he dismounted in the yard, he moved like a man who had come home rather than just arrived. Marshal, Angus greeted him with obvious pleasure. Good to see you again. Just Riley now, the former marshal said, unpinning the star from his vest, and holding it out. Turned in my commission yesterday, no regret. Riley looked around the ranch at the sturdy buildings, the well-tended land, and the woman watching from the porch with joy in her green eyes, and smiled that rare smile again. No regrets, he said. Years later, when their children asked how their parents had met, Sarah would tell them the story of the silent rancher who had ridden into a circle of outlaws and raised his hand for parley. But she never told them about the $400, or about the loneliness she had seen in their father's eyes that first night by the stream. Some stories were meant for grown-ups, and some sacrifices were too precious to share with anyone but the wind and the stars.